what are the federal barriers to transit agencies taking parking assets that they own and redeveloping them from sites like this into sites like this. And in particular, I want to identify what are the specific laws and regulations that act as hurdles to this sort of redevelopment with private partners, and how are transit agencies clearing these hurdles effectively? And actually, are they clearing them effectively? Are these hurdles perhaps too challenging, redundant, simply unreasonable? And if so, can they be cleared away rather than simply cleared over? So policymakers and planners such as Robert Severo or Ed Glaser have identified, sort of highlighted the benefits that come from locating dense developments in areas with high quality transit service. Now, the issue with that is that many of the areas that are well served by transit are not very likely to have like development opportunities for large-scale dense development. They're small parcels, they're built out, they're historic preservation requirements, zoning requirements, simply just not amenable to large-scale, this sort of large-scale development. And transit agencies themselves, as we know, aren't in great shape. They're struggling to maintain current operations, let alone sustainably fund new expansions or deal with a large influx of new riders. The transit agencies do own large land assets around stations, especially in the form of park and ride facilities. And in newer systems in particular, transit agency park and ride facilities are going underused. So for instance, at Dallas Area Rapid Transit, they're only using 50% of their park and ride capacity on the busiest days of the year. And even here in Boston, where transit usage is obviously, as we know, quite high, the MBTA took the parking garage at Quincy Center Station completely out of service, and that had no discernible effect on the availability of park and ride throughout the system. So in reaction to this, the federal government has instituted a policy called joint development, which
allows no effect on park and ride throughout the system.
Well,
they take out all the parking in Quincy, and it had no effect on what? On ridership or on park and ride throughout the system? What do you mean by that?
So when they took out the park and ride facility at the Quincy Center Station,
yes,
it did not. There was still enough capacity that the other park and rides at, for instance, Braintree or Quincy Adams, that it didn't affect the availability of commuters to come and park in that area. In reaction to sort of these possibilities, the federal government has instituted a policy called joint development, which allows transit agencies to make these kinds of development agreements with private partners. But the research that I conducted this summer for the Federal Transit Administration, transit agencies interviewed said that they found this policy to be unclear, they found it to be arduous. So my thesis really wants to drill in to this policy and ask, how are these obstacles affecting these sorts of, are they preventing these sorts of developments from happening? How can these hurdles be cleared over, and do in fact maybe they need to be consolidated, streamlined, or cleared away while still protecting the public interest? So I think it's worthwhile just right now to clarify what joint development is, because it is a federal program, and it has sort of everything to do with my thesis. So I think it was defined in the literature beginning in the 1970s and the 1980s, and it can be fairly broad. So it's everything from the Dunkin' Donuts and the Harvard Square MBTA station to the kind of large-scale redevelopment that I'm focusing on in my thesis. But what it's not is not the private sector building public transportation infrastructure. It is more strictly a real estate agreement where the private sector uses public sector assets for its benefits while sharing some of that with the public sector transit agency who actually owns the real estate. But this is not entirely a new idea. Private sector transit companies at the turn of the 20th century relied on real estate speculation to help fund their operations. And of course, this wasn't a particularly sustainable model, and as we know, the private companies were folded into the public transit agencies that we have today. And in reaction to some of the excesses of this sort of land speculation, the Federal Transit Administration put fairly strict rules on what transit agencies could do in terms of private development partnerships with land that was purchased with federal money. And this land that was purchased with federal money, that sounds like a sort of a small point, but it's actually quite important because most of the transit capacity that's been built in this country since the middle of the 20th century has been federally supported. So if we want to do these sorts of parking conversions, joint developments, a lot of it is going to happen on land that has a federal interest and is hence subject to these hurdles. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, this literature sort of emerged on sort of re-examining the idea of real estate as an activity that transit agencies could engage in. And so you have this introduction of joint development as a revenue stream. Later on, scholars began to focus on joint development as sort of an end in itself, as a way of creating transit-oriented developments. In reaction to this, the federal government did loosen its joint development policies gradually over time to become more amenable to these kinds of projects. But last year, the General Accountability Office, which is the watchdog organization for the federal government, stated that the joint development rules were still unclear, and in particular that it was preventing parking conversion and parking replacement projects like the ones we've been talking about from moving forward. So my research really hopes to kind of identify, okay, what are the specific hurdles that are preventing transit agencies from moving forward with these kinds of projects? And I sort of, from the research I've done so far, identified what these hurdles may be. As you can see, they actually come from a fairly disparate number of laws and regulations. There's no one law or rule that governs joint development. So for instance, you have things like environmental review from NEPA, but also acquisitions rules, hiring rules, and a number of different regulations that come from the surface transportation reauthorizations. And the hodgepodge of regulations that informs what you can do with these private partnerships, I think contributes to their confusion. It's honestly a little daunting. But right now is a good time to be examining these because, as you may know, Congress recently passed the MAP 21, the latest surface transportation reauthorization. And unlike its predecessor, this is only valid for 2 years, after which it must be renewed or replaced or updated. And this act also focuses on innovative financing techniques for transportation. So this is really an opportunity to say, all right, what are the rules that govern joint developments if this is actually a policy that we as a country want to pursue? And where can they be streamlined to make them easier to clear? And maybe they're just unreasonable in general. Where can they be cleared away while still preserving the public interest? In terms of methodology, I'm pursuing a case study approach. And I'm starting with some scoping interviews to talk with some initial transit agency contacts to get a sense of, are these hurdles that I've addressed so far in the last slide, are they really where the problem is? And based on those interviews, I'll also select, I'm hoping for 2 or 3 case studies that I can pursue in a more in-depth way. So maybe visit these sites, these are project-by-project sites, talk to the stakeholders who are the public partners, how did they deal with the federal process, and then I would also like to talk with the private sector development partners as well. What was their interaction with the federal process, and what's their perception of how that affected these particular projects? And the format of my thesis is going to be textual, I think for fairly obvious reasons, but I really do want to think about how some graphics and diagrammatic explanations could help make federal joint development policy, these kinds of rules, understandable. Because by making them understandable, then we make them addressable. Part of the problem right now is just simply the lack of clarity. So for next steps, I'm going to begin doing these scoping interviews. I've already selected 3 transit agency contacts that I think can sort of have contacts around the country and have a good idea of whether I'm on the right track. But I also want to cast a little bit of a wider net and maybe do a phone survey of some of the largest transit agencies, the ones with fixed guideway rail systems, and ask, have you done joint development projects? If you have, are they the Dunkin' Donuts, or are they really these large-scale kind of parking conversions that I want to focus on? And maybe just to get a sense of what their perspective is on the federal joint development regulations. So, I mean, overall, my idea is to just get a sense, what are the hurdles that transit agencies and their private sector partners face, and how are they being cleared? Are they being cleared in a way that is serving the public interest, that is actually allowing projects that make sense to go ahead? And if they're not, then examining where are the opportunities for us to just clear these hurdles away and think about how we can structure these kind of regulations to serve the public interest while also allowing these transit-oriented developments to happen. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
What did they do at Quincy? They removed the parking, but is there a new development underway?
Well, I'd love to tell you that they decided that they wanted to redevelop that parking into transit-oriented development, but typical for the MBTA, it's actually just kind of falling down, so they decided to close that parking structure.
Just empty it.
Yeah, just empty it. So there is actually a sort of big transit village project going on in Quincy Center. It's going to bring a lot of millions of square footage development to the area. But that's actually pretty separate from, that's not involving any MBTA property. But potentially in the future, you know, it could, since we're not using that parking garage right now.
You know, the talk. It strikes me that, and I really do like the word clearing, because it actually captures three different possibilities here. One is clearing the hurdles, as in the Edwin Moses metaphor, jumping over hurdles. The second is clearing away, put it in parentheses, we talked about that, clearing it away, because they're you know, they don't make sense, or they don't pencil out in some sort of cost-benefit analysis. We'll get back to that in a moment. And the third is making the hurdles clear, you know, so that, you know, which I think everyone would agree, it makes sense to make them clear as opposed to leave them ambiguous. Ambiguity in this case, I think, probably serves nobody. I mean, sometimes studied ambiguity does, but in this case, it doesn't. So you need to sort of make clear as you march forward yourself which clear you are actually dealing with. There's a danger, at least as you presented today, and you know, you list all these regulations, and I was thinking for a moment that you're voting for Romney. I don't care if you vote for Romney, that's fine with me. But you know, one could have read that slide as get rid of regulations. You know, the Clean Air Act, I mean NEPA, you had there, not the Clean Air, but NEPA, get rid of all these things, because they're hurdles for economic growth, for development.
Right.
Which is, by the way, I'm not saying that's bad or good, but I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily what you're talking about either. You're not attitudineless about this. So then there's sort of cost-benefit analysis, what Cass Sunstein has written about and what he even did, you know, when he was at the White House, if you know what I'm talking about, on cost-benefit and looking at regulations and subjecting them to the cost-benefit analysis, something that hadn't been associated necessarily with sort of more progressive kind of approach. In any event, I just think you want to make clear what your use of the word clear is about. And it can be all the, you can explore those three. I think they're all legitimate as part of what you're doing.
Well, I think one thing you said like that third definition of clear, I mean, it is a worthwhile exercise to make these policies clear, but I don't want to just sort of engage in, you know, a summary of, you know, oh, here's what the federal regulations are. You know, I think you know that.
Yes, I do.
So.
I think one way maybe to I mean, we'll focus obviously on these regulations that are making obstacles to the development of this transit agency-owned parking. One way to actually also maybe step a little bit outside of that too is to think about, at least this is the question I had in my head during the whole presentation, is why are these transit agency-owned parking lots not being used? I mean, I understand that that's not the focus of the research necessarily, but I started to wonder if there's some questions that might come out of that might also contribute to what kind of development can occur in that place. Because on the one hand, there's the need to make good and better use of those spaces, but then I was also wondering, like, I mean, I just kept thinking, really? They took away the Quincy parking and like nothing changed? I mean, I kind of kept going back to that, or even thinking about any of these parking lots, and wondering, well, is it something about the sort of distance of those stations from a more dense area? Is it something about whatever few amenities might be located? Are they just too remote for any kind of use or development? I mean, I don't know. But I think there might be some questions around those particular transit locations that might feed into the sort of more specific, the more specific issues that you're trying to get at with the redevelopment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it should be clear as well that it's not just sort of talking about, well, this parking, I think you're really having a hard time with this clicker today. This parking isn't being used, and hence let's just, you know, put a building on it. In a lot of cases, they end up what they say is, well, we have a surface parking lot now, but we could put up a garage. Actually, that's what they did here, and then have room for you know, development without actually getting rid of any parking spaces. But you're right in that, like, you know, what kind of development you're going to pursue on a site, and Oakland is going to be different from what you're going to pursue in Quincy. So yeah, that's definitely.
I think part of that question also is maybe developing what the public interest is. Or because, when you can say like it's in the public interest, but in my mind, I actually have no idea what that would be, and I imagine it's probably different depending on, you suddenly have to define who your public is, who you want your public to be, and probably looking at the regulations, like whoever wrote those regulations has an idea of what their public is. And maybe that would help you understand why those came into place and why there's a problem with them if there is. So,
I mean, the
Yeah.
issue, I'm sorry.
Well, I think I really agree with that point. I think for me, that's what you're putting forward, which is that you're calling something a hurdle, but then but those are also these legislations which are, by definition in some publics good. And so if you're going to be positioning, like that's your thesis statement, is that you want to facilitate, you want to kind of clear this away so that this can be more smoothly executed, but in what form, I think is the big question. And so, in a sense, hurdles, I don't know, I guess I think, like, it's a hurdle if it's completely unknown, it's like leading to all kinds of confusion, everything's delayed, there's no total ambiguity, but there's also hurdles which are meant to be directive, right? So, like, the legislation is meant to be directive of certain types of relationships. So I think I would just be really careful about that language, to be very, make definitions that clarify your intention about what the public is, and how, maybe it's about kind of like redirecting how that legislation is interpreted or something.
But we've heard 3 of the 4 presentations this morning that are very, very instrumental in what they're trying to do, and they start at a point where there's the presumption that we've got to clear away these hurdles, for example, or we've got to make the settler thing, work, or or with David, to begin with, we've got to make China invest here more. It's that kind of, and of course, what people are saying is, well, wait a second, maybe we need the parking, or maybe we should have parking to encourage the sort of other goals of transit-oriented development, which is to get more people to use mass transit, by of course they actually, drive to the mass transit, but at least, I mean, at a certain point you can't cover everything, but certainly, recognizing where you're starting from, and then of course questioning, well, why are these things there? I mean, that's why I said it's much easier for me to sort of say, we should clear out ambiguities, unless it's an intentional ambiguity or the ambiguity itself serves a purpose. I understand that doesn't interest you, and I'm not suggesting that you do that. But that's sort of like, I don't want to say no-brainer, but it's instrumentalized ambiguity is, it actually exists a lot, but it's probably not the best thing in the world unless. Why not then just say no? As opposed to make the hurdle. It's so ambiguous, I don't even know how to get over it. I don't like that kind of untransparent kind of process. That's my own bias. But I think again, why are these things there? Of course, but you're starting further down the line. I assume we don't need the parking, or I assume it's going to be verticalized and we can accommodate parking elsewhere. So we've solved that problem, and now we're just. If we start from the proposition that joint development is a good thing, what hurdles are necessary or not necessary? And that starts down the line further than, and everybody's saying, well, at least set that up at a minimum.
Right, and before you know it, then you're sort of sweeping.
Well, no, I'm not. I wasn't. Yes, but that's the point.
Well, and you're right. I think that idea of the public interest, because in theory, we're having this conversation because we think transit-oriented development is in the public interest, and that's sort of the literature that I'll draw from. But also, these regulations exist to serve the public interest, to prevent a transit agency from, giving some land to his brother who's a developer
right.
or something.
Or NEPA is supposed to consider environmental impacts.
Right.
So that it's there for a reason.
So yeah, and I
know.
absolutely want to be explicit about that. So.
But I think that's why you need to define what your public is and what those interests might be, because that could be anything. I mean, anything from environmental issues to.
Well, I mean, it's, yeah, I can clear away the hurdle, just amend NEPA so it no longer applies to this. But, so the hurdle's gone now. And Edward Moses, doesn't even have to jump. Okay, so that's why, what is it there for, is, and then is it just, we can achieve the same objective, but, by cutting off 60 days and making it cheaper, and, you don't have to consider, everybody at some level is for that. That's cost effectiveness rather than cost, same objective, but doing it cheaper, better.
Right.
A good way to do that is maybe you're actually looking at why this was built to begin with, and what kind of plan was it that put it there. And I think it would answer many of the questions. Just how did, because I was thinking, my goodness, how did it end up being such a large parking lot there? Somebody must have thought it out for some reason. And it was just, I think it's a good starting point for all the rest.
But, if we do get to the point where, in fact, joint development is a good thing, then that's totally credible. So we can get there. In other words, I fully believe that the public interest can be, in fact, served by joint development, which is sort of where you're starting, and you've, I think, been appropriately reminded to back up a little bit, and make the case that that's true. In those cases, then let's look at what seems to be making it difficult and see if there are good reasons for it to be difficult, or whether it could be made simpler and easier without harming other aspects that are being served by these regulations. That's, again, the whole debate of, again, we saw that with Romney and Obama the other night. Oil, gas, let's do all this stuff, versus, yes, I'm for oil and gas and coal, but I want it also to be clean. Well, that's one is a hurdler, and the other is saying, no hurdles.
Right.
Okay, and this is an old trope, we've heard this 1,000 times. Plays into here.
I think I liked your comment that you wanted to try to find ways to visualize the work, because I think that's really, especially when one of the intentions is about just clarification of what's going on, and to be able to draw, like I'm just kind of picturing a series of axonometric diagrams which describe the physical form and the relationship between the transit, the development, the parking, and then possibly annotating the way in which these different legislations have impacted that form, like where is it, what are the environmental, what were the concerns, are they localized in a certain area, just to be able to kind of make some relationship between this legislation and then the actual kind of result of that could be really interesting.
Yeah. Especially because you're a student of design school.
Thank you.
Thank you.